Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is Funeral Service Insider from Kates-Boylston. Each episode features conversations about emerging trends and news that affect the death care industry. We talk to people who understand the delicate balance of change in a profession and vocation steeped in tradition. This week, I'm speaking with Allison C. Meier. She is a Brooklyn-based writer, editor, and researcher whose latest book, Grave, was published last year as part of the Object Lessons book series from Bloomsbury Press. She's the editor of Fine Books and Collections magazine and has bylines in The New York Times, City Lab, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and many other publications. Actually, she came to our attention, and we'll talk about it in the show, for some writing she did for Atlas Obscura. She moonlights as a cemetery tour guide, which is what we're going to talk to her about today. As always, stay on for the postmortem following the closing credits. This week, we're going to talk about kind of aquamation, a new project that's going on in Oklahoma that I covered in this week's FSI you really need to know about. But for now, hang on for our conversation with Allison C. Meier right after this message from our sponsor, Homesteaders. Homesteaders traces its roots back to the early 1900s when the average family had to stretch $10 in weekly earnings for food, housing, and other essentials. An unexpected disruption, like the death of a loved one, could cripple their financial position, resulting in children as young as 10 entering the workforce. When Homesteaders issued its first policy in February 1906, they provided families with invaluable peace of mind, knowing they would not have to sacrifice their financial security to pay for a loved one's funeral. Homesteaders has persevered through some of the most profound periods of economic hardship, social unrest, and grief in American history. 2 world wars, the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression, and 2 global pandemics. Homesteaders has weathered it all and never failed to pay a claim. Today, the company safeguards more than 800,000 families across the country. Homesteaders knows that pre-need is both a growth engine and a safeguard for funeral providers. For more than a century, they've built solutions tailored to the funeral profession, including their industry-leading account executive support, the profession's only true casket price protection program, and a library of technology solutions designed to connect funeral providers with more consumers than ever before. Homesteaders understands that when it comes to pre-need, one size fits all isn't the best fit. That's why they work with their customers to design pre-need programs that are custom built for your business, not anyone else's. Visit homesteaderslife.com today to find out why personalized pre-need starts with Homesteaders. So you first came to my attention as a writer when I saw an article that you had done on JSTOR, and it was like a collection, like a reading list of grave books. So I'd like to start there, and if you could talk to me about like how you decided, how you got the assignment or how you decided to take up that article and how it led you to what would eventually become Grave.
Sure. So I've been writing for JSTOR Daily. I wish I could remember the exact year, but for a number of years. And they were a great site to sort of, there's so much valuable and really interesting material published in scholarly journals that doesn't often get onto, the
Right.
public radar of daily circulation. And so they have these things called reading lists where they get a quote unquote expert to curate sort of a collection of texts that are available through JSTOR. And what I think is very cool is like a research nerd is, JSTOR can cost money, but anything linked in this article becomes free. So I enjoy doing them for that reason. But yeah, because I had been thinking a lot about the care of the dead and how it's changed over time. And of course, as it's changing now, that's the theme of the reading list. And it really spans decades of material. Like, it has articles going back, I think, at least to the 80s, and looking at the very early examples of intentional human burial during like the Middle Paleolithic period, going all the way up now to, I think it culminates sort of with looking at something like body worlds and aquamation and all these somewhat still new ways of um, dis- disposition of the dead.
And it's like if you start at the beginning and read your way through, then you are a burial history expert, or at
Right.
least or at least something very close to it. When was this part of your research for the book, or was this what kicked off your research for the book?
It kind of came after, actually. I had not written for J. Star Daily in a little while, and then this is not a unique story. The pandemic sort of disrupted a bit my regular writing process because I just got tired, which is not a unique story, but I hadn't been doing what I used to do a ton, which is these online bloggy sort of posts. And so this actually came after I published the book, is when I pitched this to them as a reading list. And I did two at the time. There's also one about museums and human remains, because although that isn't really related to my book, I think it is connected to the way we care for the dead, especially. So those were things I pitched sort of at the same time when I saw they were doing these reading lists.
And as long as you mentioned it, what came out? What was some of the things that came out in the Museum of Human Remains story that was surprising?
I think, and this is probably something I should have written about more in my book, but it's a very small book. I have been really interested lately in the conversations happening around human remains in museums. This obviously isn't a new topic, but I think there's been a lot of change lately. Like you might have seen in the news that the American Museum of Natural History finally has removed all of its human remains that were on view. Like that just happened in October of last year. And there has been, I think, increased attention to how a lot of marginalized communities were, without consent, the basis of a lot of medical history museums. Things from everything from the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia to like the Hunterian Museum in London have had these conversations about them. And so because this isn't a topic that has just, sprung out of nowhere, obviously, like I think it was in the 1990s that the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed. But of course, that didn't solve this issue entirely. So yeah, I think that that's grave related. I think a lot about who has been denied a grave, who has been privileged to have a grave, and so even though we might not think of museums as graves, they have become graves for quite a lot of people.
It's interesting, the idea that, we're at first everybody's like, yes, we should give all this stuff back, and then they're like, wow, that's an awful lot of stuff.
Yeah, but
to have to give back.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, especially with human remains, I think especially the idea of human remains being used for public displays and entertainment is definitely something that deserves critical thought and probably has deserved it for many decades, but finally is getting a lot more of a spotlight on it.
It wasn't uncommon to like display, robbers or John Dillinger, right? Didn't John Dillinger got displayed, and that had to be in the 30s.
Yeah, you're getting into territory I'm not super familiar with. But I do know I'm from Oklahoma, and there's a weird case. I don't know if you know about Elmer McCurdy. He was this train robber that his body got displayed, and then at some point they forgot he was real, and he ended up in a fun house. It's a very long and wild story.
We ran that actually in American Cemetery sometime last year. But yes, it is a really bizarre story how when you do things with, other than bury corpses. Actually, I covered a story last year of a gentleman named Stoneman Willie who had been on display at the funeral home. He had been waiting for family members to pick him up for 150 years or something like that.
Oh, wow.
He was an experiment, a prisoner, and he died in prison. And they experimented on him with new embalming. Chemical embalming was new at the time. And and they petrified him. So they
Oh,
turned him
wow.
essentially into this piece of wood that they would, they had kids go and visit, as part of class trips, as late as the 1950s. So, you were right. I'm sorry that I detoured both of us,
Oh, no, these are
but,
great.
but
This
the
stuff is
story,
all fascinating.
it really, really is. So when you were going through, let's go back to Care of the Dead. When you were going through these stories, was there anything that kind of retroactively shaped the way you were looking at the story that you were writing, or were any of these pieces of research that you used when you were writing your book?
Yeah, so I published the book in February of 2023, and this reading list came out in November of
Okay.
2023, so they're a little bit of space apart, but I have continued always to, I guess, challenge or rethink anything I think just as a general
Mm.
practice. And so I did feel like looking, there was a lot that I haven't really thought about in relation. There was one, I got to find what the author is because it was really interesting. I've written and talked about a lot the rural cemetery movement, which I'm sure probably your listeners are tired of hearing about, but that 19th century, big American movement of all these beautiful cemeteries. And I had never, and this is again always looking for new ways to challenge my thoughts. There's an article I read by Diane Jones from the Landscape Journal, and it's looking at how does what Black cemeteries were looking like in the 19th century contrast with that rural cemetery movement, and thinking about how when we see a different kind of landscape now that's different from either the lawn style cemetery or the beautiful Victorian rural cemetery, that we're like, oh, that's not right, it's neglected or something, but that there's a lot of different cultural ideas about what cemetery environment should look like. And so that was, I thought, really interesting and something I did not know that much about, so I was excited to read her research.
It is very cool. Actually, I pulled up the article. So it's called "The City of the Dead: The
Mhm.
Place of Cultural Identity and the Environmental Sustainability of the African American Cemetery." Link in the show notes.
Perfect.
um, I'm sorry. So we featured you recently in American Cemetery and Cremation, and you're a tour guide.
Yeah, I've been leading tours mostly at New York City area cemeteries since I think 2011.
And that was where you did most of your getting comfortable to write this book, Grave. Can you tell me about how you got the gig doing the tours, and how that played into your book?
Yeah, and it definitely was. I guess I'd say like most of the on the ground thinking was based on that. I definitely did not ever, I guess I don't know if anyone ever plans to be a cemetery tour guide, but
Right.
I have a background in journalism and writing. And when I moved to New York in 2009, I just happened to move next to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And it was just this astounding place. I had never seen a cemetery that was that very heightened 19th century Victorian with all the soaring angels and grand entrance. And I just got really interested in it as a place of potential storytelling. And now they have Greenwood has incredible programming now. They do not need me as much, I think, anymore. But I noticed that they had quite a lot of tours about specific topics like the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, and these are all important, I think, to highlight. But there wasn't things about symbolism or things about forgotten disasters that you could remember through the place. And so those were the kind of tours I started doing. And then since that, I've done things at everywhere from Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, this very old historic pet cemetery, to a tour where it was called This Used to Be a Cemetery, and we walked around Manhattan to sites where cemeteries no longer were, and there could be bones still there. That tour, I will say, was very unpopular because people, I think,
Right.
like to look at things, is what I learned from that.
I heard a joke. A comedian told a joke about going on a Jack the Ripper tour, and he said they try to make it
Mm.
scary, but you're still standing in front of a subway.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
the work that you do in getting these cemetery stories, though, it's very similar to journalism in that you have to find a niche. You have to find a story that's not getting told and pitch why you should get to tell it. So there's a lot of I guess kind of front loading in that. Can you talk about the first tour you developed and how you saw that come together, and whether and how that affects the way that you do tours or look for tour topics now?
Right. And I think one of the earliest one was that Disasters of New York tour I mentioned. I don't think it was the very first, but it might have been the second. The first was I used to work for Atlas Obscura, and at the time they had something called Obscura Day where you would sort of organize field trips in your own backyard, quote unquote. And since my backyard was the closest to Greenwood, we did a visit to their catacombs, this really long group mausoleum. But that one was sort of like, we're walking there, walking back. And then the one I did the first actual like research was that Disasters. And I thought it was, I think it sort of informed how I've continued to do things, is make sure that the topic has a resonance beyond the cemetery. I think there's totally a place for, here are all the most famous people in the cemetery, let's go see them. But for me, I'm always interested in what is a story people can carry with them out of here. And so thinking about all these disasters that had happened in the New York City area, and that this was the place to remember them because there weren't any public memorials for them, or they really had just kind of been completely forgotten. Like one was the Wall Street bombing, which happened right on Wall Street. And you can still see the pockmarks from the blast, like in the actual stone on that street, but there's nothing there to tell you that's what you're looking at. And so I think that using the memorials to individuals in the cemetery to like tell those stories, I hoped kind of made people think about, even if you're not a New Yorker, like what are the events near me that people who experience them probably would be astounded they could ever be forgotten, and how can we honor the dead by remembering that as part of our city's story. And
just briefly, that was anarchists? Was that the Wall Street bombing?
Yeah, and this is again a tour I've heard that a decade ago, so it's I sort of was treading lightly over the
that's fine
details, but yeah, I think people are not aware how many anarchist bombings there were at a certain point in the 1920s in New York, and so that's also a whole other sort of story that I have not specifically done a tour about that, but I think that kind of when you're highlight or another thing on that tour was the General Slocum steamship fire, which I believe, and everyone listening should fact check all these things, but I believe was second to, until 9/11 happened, I believe was the highest single day of mortality for people in the city. Again, this should be fact, but it was this huge disaster that I bet if you stop people on the street, like 90% of them would not know what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's why I was confused, because there was a disaster that closed the Statue of Liberty arm in the 1920s.
Oh, it was the Black Tom Island.
There you go, the Black Tom. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I think
that's what I was trying to get you to say, because I couldn't remember it. And so you have all these stories that you've kind of got walking around in your head, and as you say, you do the tours, and then I guess do you retire them and start new ones? Yeah, for better or worse, that journalism background makes me always feel like, well, I need to find a new story. Right. So most recently, I think what the newest tour I've done was about the language of flowers and how that informs symbolism. But we also at Greenwood visited the grave of a woman who wrote a Language of Flowers books, and I don't think she had been on any tour before. So I'm always looking for a new angle into things. I don't think the people on the tours necessarily care as much as me that everything is always a new perspective, but I think that also keeps it interesting to me. Hi, I want to take a second to talk to you about the upcoming Kates-Boylston Funeral Service Business Plan Conference set for June 4th and 5th at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Warwick, Rhode Island. This has always been one of our more popular conferences because we bring together experts from all over the industry to talk about up-to-the-minute solutions and approaches to getting your funeral business on the track that you want it. One of the best things about these in-person conferences is you get to speak with the experts face to face, and get one-time information that won't be available anyplace else. For instance, there's an opening night cocktail party where we always have the opportunity to catch up with colleagues, to make new connections, and to engage in meaningful conversations with the speakers as well as with funeral directors from all over the country. In addition to the cocktail party, your registration includes 2 days worth of sessions and breakfast and lunch both days. It also includes 1-year subscriptions to American Funeral Director and American Cemetery and Cremation, which is a $100 value in itself. This is one conference you don't want to miss. Early bird registration is open now, and the price is $199 until April 25th. Event sponsors this year are Implant Recycling, Procoa, and Homesteaders Life Company. Visit events.kates-boylston.com today to register, or, as always, you can find the link in the show notes. Make connections, ignite ideas, and be inspired. Register now and be part of the future of funeral service. See you in Warwick. So, kind of along those lines, you eventually pitched and were able to get this book published. What was that process like, and what did you want to bring to the thousands of year old conversation that you didn't think had been well enough amplified?
Sure. So I'd been a big fan of the Object Lessons book series for a long time. They're this series of very compact books that look broadly at an object, and they've done everything from bread to the ocean to hood to bookshelf, and I just think they're such a cool nonfiction series. So when I saw that they were taking pitches, I actually initially pitched them Tombstone, and they were not into it. And then I came back because I wanted to be part of the series, and I pitched Grave, which I think they were right to embrace that approach more, because I think it does have a much broader cultural and societal meaning. So I was interested because they've had this series going for years of these books, but they haven't had any object that has related to death. And I think that there was room there to bring that into the conversation of their series. And then also, it is pretty daunting, as you said, like thousands of years and not more, because I think I write in the book, if this was about every single grave since the dawn of time, it would be like the longest book ever written. And so I knew that's not really what I wanted to do. But thinking back to what we were talking about with the tour guiding is just to, from that sense, act as a bit of a tour guide in the book to what the specifically American grave has been, what it is now, and what it could be. And then, of course, when I pitched this, I want to say it was 2021, I think, when I pitched it, but I did not realize how long the pandemic would really shut down things in New York. And so I ended up writing this at the height of Omicron mostly, which really, at first I was frustrated because I had all these dreams, like I'm going to go all over the country and see the great American cemeteries. And then that was not possible. But I think that kind of concentrated view also made it more focused. So, you write the book, you can write in that moment. And that's what I ended up doing for this one.
And when people ask you, like, what are your 2 favorite stories, or what were the things that you thought you brought out so well that people, really needed to know about them? Was there something that kind of stands out along those lines?
Yeah, there were 2 places that I think have not gotten widespread attention. Like, I did go to Mount Auburn. Everyone loves Mount Auburn and Massachusetts, but I also highlighted Gower Cemetery in my home state of Oklahoma, which is this Black homesteaders cemetery and is actually the only physical surviving evidence that there were Black homesteaders on the land run, which I did not know about actually until I went there. And the fact you can go there and see it, and that they also included a Potter's Field sort of section where anyone that needed a place to be buried could be interred. And it's such a there's been a lot of care in the community to be sure that it stands, but I think that highlighting a cemetery like that and that what it means to the visibility of history, I think is really important. And then I think the other one that I also don't think has been written about a lot is there's a place called St. Peter's Church in Manhattan. A lot of design nerds know about it because Massimo and Lella Vignelli, these very famed designers, just worked on the entire interior. It's an incredible space, like beautiful modernist church interior. But they also have a columbarium there that was installed at the height of the AIDS crisis in New York City because they wanted to be able to inter their community within community at a time a lot of AIDS victims were ending up on Hart Island, the Potter's Field, or being turned away from funeral homes. So those are two places that I think they link into the story I was trying to tell about. Graves are often, they are always, of course, to inter the dead, but they can mean a lot of different things, and why they are created and why it's important to continue to recognize they're there, I think, are part of that story.
You mentioned Hart's Island and you went.
Yeah, I went. I could not have picked a weirder time to go. Like early March 2020, which I think I write about this in the book. Of course, I had no idea that it would mean that it would suddenly have this international stage as a
You know what? Let
visible.
me
Yeah,
let me interrupt you. Tell everybody
yeah.
what Hart Island is.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Maybe just you and I know it. It occurred to me that there are other people listening, and I'm like, tell me about Hart Island.
No, totally. Because even in New York City, so basically since the late 1860s, it has been New York City's public burial place. It's mass grave for the unidentified, the impoverished, the anyone who otherwise is unable to pay for a grave or chooses to not pay for a grave. And it's an island, which every city has to, of course, manage. It's unclaimed, but I think New York is kind of unique in what it does. And so it's this island off the coast of the Bronx where people, and it's been the same since the 19th century, have been interred together in these very long trenches in wooden coffins on this island. And it has actually recently had some change. It was transferred from Department of Correction because for a long time, incarcerated people interred the dead. And now NYC Parks is overseeing it. So we are sort of at this moment of not sure what the future of Hart Island. But when I went there, I was still, I think it's interesting because it comes in and out of visibility. So now, with this transfer to parks, people are able to actually go to Hart Island on these park ranger led tours, which was not the case when I went there. You could only go either, I've actually gone twice. I haven't gone on the new NYC Parks visits, but anybody could sign up to go to the quote unquote gazebo, which is the sort of a very simple wooden structure, and you would just be able to stand there for an hour in the middle of Hart Island. And then the other one is you could go, of course, as a mourner, and I went as a support mourner for a friend and to the island. And what was striking to me is there were the long trenches there where people were being interred, likely that very day. And then just a week or two later, there was this new attention to Hart Island with people relating those trenches to the high deaths from COVID, which there were, but I think what got lost is that those trenches had been there. It's just that people hadn't seen them.
Right.
And I ended up writing a story for National Geographic about that time, about Hart Island, because, there was so much more visibility on it. But I think, yeah, it's a striking place to go. I'm struggling to find the words for it because it is a strange place that is both, I think, beautiful in some ways, and that's why I'm interested that NYC Parks is taking over now, because there are birds there. There's actually deer I saw on the island. New York doesn't have a lot of these wild places within the city limits.
Right.
But then it's also a very sad place, where a lot of people have been interred and not honored, and there's been a lot of access issues over the years that I hope are changing. But yeah, Hart Island is a complex place.
Excellent. And we are coming toward the end. We've got some time left, but I do want to ask you, is there anything that I should have asked you, something that you wanted to talk about and I didn't give you the chance, or something that you thought I'd ask and I didn't?
I don't know. It's such a broad topic, I think, the grave. And so my real challenge with the book was to not, they're meant to be short books, to not make it the most
Right.
colossal book ever written. And I think there's always going to be more to say about it. I was really, I think, overwhelmed when I decided to write the book, because there are so many excellent books out there about cemeteries and graves and the design of everything. And I was really happy that a lot of people shared their time to talk with me, like the pastor at St. Peter's Church, Jared Stoller, that place I mentioned with the
Mm.
columbarium, or I was able to talk to like Carla Rothstein, who runs the Death Lab at Columbia University, that's doing really interesting work related to the future, which we haven't really talked about, but like the future grave. And they're doing interesting stuff with biomaterial and creating these luminous pods that could also be public memorial spaces. So yeah, I think I really appreciated that this was not just me sitting down to write all of my thoughts, but I really valued everyone that gave me their time and sharing their expertise, because there are so many people doing really interesting work now to rethink what the grave is.
Yeah, and we can maybe even have you back to talk about that. I've got a bunch of aquamation. We ran
Oh,
aquamation last week. We're running next week. It is a very hot topic. If I can do a little preview for you and for the listeners, I'm right now working on a story about Oklahoma, where
oh,
they're using aquamation as nutrients for the fields, for the hay, and particularly animals. They have just made a huge investment to make this big facility where they'll use aquamation to turn animals into essentially fertilizer for the hay. It's a really
oh,
exciting
wow.
up and coming project. So yeah, it's you would think that you start a book about graves and you'd be like, okay, well, there's probably not much more to say. And as you say, in another 15 years, the conversation about disposition is going to be entirely different. And last but not least, I want to ask you about you do trees now. So you're working your way kind of out of the graveyard to the borderlands there. And can you tell me a little bit about your work on trees, and then I can let you go.
Yeah, I do a whole bunch of, so I should say I'm mostly an arts writer. So it's sort of, I report a lot about art, and I edit a magazine called Fine Books and Collections magazine. So I got a lot going on. But trees, I love trees. I actually am leading the Great Trees of Greenwood tour at Greenwood Cemetery this spring. So if anyone's in New York, I'll be out there. But I've been really fascinated with the NYC Parks has this list of official great trees. And there's something just funny and fascinating to me about what makes a tree great, like how are we judging trees? And so I've been trying to see every tree on the great tree list, but I know that they are actually updating that list, because I think it dates to the 80s. And so it's weirdly missing a lot of local greats. Like it doesn't have the big tulip tree in Alley Pond Park in Queens, which is supposedly our tallest and oldest tree. But I did do a map, fairly recently with Blue Crow Media of Great Trees of New York. And then, of course, thinking about the fact that you can never cover everything. As
Right.
soon as that came out, there were like 20 trees I didn't include, that I was like, oh, gotta do more on this. So I might be at the intersection of these things. I have a project in the very early stages with some friends to maybe do a cemetery tree zine or something, but we will see. If that comes about, I will definitely let you know.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Homesteaders traces its roots back to the early 1900s, when the average family had to stretch $10 in weekly earnings for food, housing, and other essentials. An unexpected disruption, like the death of a loved one, could cripple their financial position, resulting in children as young as 10 entering the workforce. When Homesteaders issued its first policy in February 1906, they provided families with invaluable peace of mind, knowing they would not have to sacrifice their financial security to pay for a loved one's funeral. Homesteaders has persevered through some of the most profound periods of economic hardship, social unrest, and grief in American history. 2 world wars, the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression, and 2 global pandemics. Homesteaders has weathered it all and never failed to pay a claim. Today, the company safeguards more than 800,000 families across the country. Homesteaders knows that pre-need is both a growth engine and a safeguard for funeral providers. For more than a century, they've built solutions tailored to the funeral profession, including their industry-leading account executive support, the profession's only true casket price protection program, and a library of technology solutions designed to connect funeral providers with more consumers than ever before. Homesteaders understands that when it comes to pre-need, one size fits all isn't the best fit. That's why they work with their customers to design pre-need programs that are custom built for your business, not anyone else's. Visit homesteaderslife.com today to find out why personalized pre-need starts with Homesteaders. Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. I've already said it, but I will say it again. Make sure you check out the show notes, because that's where we keep all the good stuff. It's where you can get in touch with us and leave feedback. You can find all of the links mentioned in today's episode. I always say subscribe where you're listening now, and I always mean please do. So we are available on Spotify, we're available on Apple Music, and we're available on Amazon. If you are listening to it and you're listening to podcasts on it, you can listen to our podcast on it. If you follow, then the podcast will download automatically and you won't have to keep track of when the next show is. And now, the postmortem. This week in Funeral Service Insider, you will see a story about how some funeral directors are using funeral technology to change farming in Oklahoma. It's a really exciting story. They're using the premise behind alkaline hydrolysis to take care of animals, large farm animals. And this is something that has been done before, but what's unique about this approach is they're using that animal effluent to treat the land in Oklahoma. Right now, they're just using it on hay, and there's going to be tons of tests done, but eventually the hope is that it can be used on all sorts of crops because it has a restorative property to the land. And this idea that we just don't have to sit around and continue to add chemicals to the ground to make things grow out of it, that we can actually encourage it by doing a better job with managing the parts of the animal that we don't use and can't repurpose. Again, it is early days, but it's exciting, and we'll have all the details on Thursday, in the Thursday, March 14th, 2024, for those of you who are listening in the future, issue of Funeral Service Insider, the newsletter. But that's it for this week, and until next time, this has been Funeral Service Insider, the podcast.